So, something that's been on my heart as of late, and this has something to do with Crisis Core, and the fact that I returned it was, well, not necessarily Crisis Core, but sort of modern games in general, and the fact that I haven't exactly been wowed with whatever games have been, brought to my attention from these big, how do you say, big conventions. There we go. Is the fact that gaming nowadays feels pretty homogenous in terms of how things look. In some cases, how things play. There are definitely standouts in the gaming scene, no doubt. In fact, you probably can think of three off the top of your head right now of modern games that stand out from the crowd. But in my case, oftentimes I'm not wowed like I used to be with how gaming was. Like it's hard for me to describe, um, but and the reason why it's hard for me to describe is because I have to admit to something that in my younger years, and by younger years I mean a couple months ago, that I didn't want to admit, but it is the fact that gaming is art. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, uh, short to the point, video games can capture the imagination like no other medium due to the fact that they are an interactive medium. Like I'm playing with Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm 2 and exploring the world of Naruto, this is something that even in the manga or the anime, I don't get this level of detail with because, quite frankly, I'm not connected. I have no bearing on where the characters go or what they interact with like I do in a video game. And because of that, it allows the medium to stick out in ways that couldn't be what's the word I'm looking for? Couldn't be told through a traditional story, or like a movie or a book or something like that, right? So, with that being said, the reason why I wanted to, or rather came to this realization that games are art, were mostly because of what I personally gravitated to. Even what I'm playing right now, you can consider Naruto Ultimate Ninja 2 Storm 2 a retro game, right? It came out a long time ago, and it's not getting any type of support unless you count Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm Connections as support, which it's definitely not. It's its own video game. But with that being said, there is like no easy way for me to say this, but games, especially older games, had a type of vision that I don't necessarily see, or the vision that they do have doesn't necessarily appeal to me in the same way these older games had. And you can definitely see like the corporate fangs sink themselves into video games as a whole, with their battle pass, loot boxes, and what you call it. Not necessarily hero shooters. That is a genre, but nevertheless, it kind of paints the same picture. The fact that the vision isn't there, or at least not to the extent that it would appeal to me specifically, like these older games. And while Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm 2 is an okay example of a game that has vision, mostly due to the fact that it is a licensed game, so its vision is rather limited into what it can show due to the fact that it's supposed to follow the events of Naruto as a whole. There is a much better game that I could bring as an example for a game that had vision, and that's The Wind Waker. So, in case you didn't know, Zelda, after I want to say Majora's Mask, went through this weird period where the audience for it really wanted a 3D Zelda game. a realistic 3D Zelda game. Let me clarify. And the devs of Zelda, the dev team, decided, hey, what if we did none of that and made a game purely for ourselves? And there is a lot of documented, documented interviews going around Wind Waker saying how Shigeru Miyamoto did not want Wind Waker to be a cartoony game. He knew what the market wanted, and the dev team was not delivering to that. But nevertheless, they still went forth on making this cartoony like Zelda, and it is a game that sticks out like a sore thumb even to this day due to its visuals. And you know, part of the reason why in earlier videos I said that, sometimes good games fall through the cracks is because they legitimately do. Because even though the audience wants X, sometimes the devs want to do Y. And it's not necessarily that Y is bad or like something that will sink a game. But depending on how the audience reacts to it, it can, in fact, sink a game because it's not necessarily what they wanted from it. Now, in the case of Wind Waker, fortunately, Zelda as a whole is big enough to still, what's the one I'm looking for? Still sell, despite the fact that it was not a game that the core audience wanted. However, looking back at it all these years later, it ends up being, like I said, a really unique game in Zelda's lineup. It is a breath of fresh air to its visual style, where Zelda, up until that point, realistic, yeah, it was trying to be realistic. Even though the N64's graphic didn't lend itself to that, that's what Zelda was trying to do. So, in that case, despite the fact that, the general audience wasn't there for it, this is a game with vision. It was made with a specific, type of person, mayhaps not. But it was made with a specific idea, an ideology, I guess, for lack of a better term, in mind. And it really comes across in how the entirety of Hyrule is created in the Wind Waker. It is... what's the word I'm looking for? It's just really lively in comparison to anything else Zelda has done. And, in a different world, you could probably... you could probably see that game, because it is so different, sinking the franchise. And unfortunately, because of how much of a risk something like that would be, I think that is a very big hurdle for video games today to jump over. How do you say? When it comes to a casual audience, there is no question that they would prefer a live action version of something rather than a cartoon version. And my evidence for this are the Marvel movies. Mostly something like Spider-Man, because Spider-Man has had many incarnations of movies throughout the years. Excuse me. Where, despite the fact that Spider-Man has had a big cartoon presence, has had a pretty big comic book presence, I don't think that necessarily a majority of the audience that watched Spider-Man floated on to either cartoon or comic book. They stayed relatively contained in the movie. I have no, numerical evidence to back this up, but considering the fact that, these Marvel movies make billions and billions of dollars and you don't hear the same thing about comic books or TV shows, I feel like that's, a good indication of that. But because of that, and because, gaming has overly what's like overly centralized graphics to an unhealthy amount. We have finally reached that point where, graphics are no longer a big selling point to video games, which is a very funny statement because they are 100% a huge selling point to video games even to this day, but because of how much video games look like one another nowadays, they're not standing out like they should. And in order to get them to stand out, you would need to do something different, do something risky. But of course, the risky stuff is risky. And because of how much money there is in video games, that's not necessarily something that a financer wants to hear. And that is unfortunate because, again, video games are art. And the thing is, with art, they don't necessarily fuse all too well with big corporate greed, for lack of a better term. And in that case, that's where you see a lot of, the loot box systems, a lot of, not necessarily hero shooters. They good hero shooters can come out, but anyways, my point is that because of the risk of making something look unique, because of the risk of making a gameplay style that could potentially alienate an audience, even alienate an already existing audience, games have more or less stagnated now, which is not necessarily, not even necessarily, that is not good for video games as a whole. It's quite terrible, in fact. And honestly, that's like the biggest reason as to why I, even to this day, still find myself playing like these old arcadey games or these old Xbox and PS3 games, is because that these are games made at a different time. And even though that in the realm of anime, stuff like the Storm series has been like super played out, when this game came out, when Storm 2 came out, there was nothing like it. Like, Storm 1, obviously, to a very, very, very small percent, because Storm 1 is a much more different game than Storm 2. But anyways, like, there was nothing like this when it came out. But because Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm 2 and other Storm games are so successful, and CC2 is like really one of the few anime devs that bring home the bacon in terms of sales, a lot of stuff gets shoveled over to them, and I can only imagine that they're told, make this like the Naruto games, because the Naruto games have sold. But that's not necessarily what makes an interesting game, is by relying on already utilized mechanics and gameplay styles that have overstayed their welcome for, oh geez, how long has the series been going on for? Like the ultimate. Anyways, I'm not even gonna think about that. Right. So, how do you say? Another thing is that this is like a weird part that came to mind, but that, sometimes, because we live now in an age of games being overly polished, is that, sometimes the weird game-breaking bugs or glitches can actually add on to the charm of a game, but because now those things are going to be patched out, like what I'm going through right now, they can actually end up taking away and lend to a very uninspiring game to play. But I guess that's more of a conversation of DLC or patches in general to make games better, quote unquote better. Sometimes they make games way better. But sometimes patches can actually take away the fun from a game. That's a case by case basis and not exactly something that I was aiming to talk about in this video. But with that being said, because, well, I guess this actually transitions well into what I wrote down, is that, no piece of art has perfect lines in it. And trying to smooth out all the rough edges and create perfect lines and things of that nature kind of goes against the point of art. Hence why, okay, there's a great example that I just remembered. So, like a lot of, I'll just say it. So, when I was younger, I remember the older people than me, not older kids, I like older YouTubers talking about Symphony of the Night and mentioning its bad voice acting and things of that nature. And then when it came to like a remake or remaster or whatever it was on the PS4, I remember they updated the audio, the voice acting for it. And the first thing that hit my mind was like, oh no, they made the voice acting good because the bad audio is actually a part of the experience. It's kind of hard to like put into words why that is. Like it's just something that is intrinsically linked to certain video games, especially certain video games of the past. And because, if anything, I'm not saying to bring back bad voice acting in games, but what I am trying to say is that part of this whole modern game thing where there are patches galore and, you know, you're really, you're really not given a fully completed game. And I understand that games back then had bugs, but at the same time, when a game was out, it was out. Like devs had to have confidence that they ironed out enough to make the game a worthwhile experience, despite the fact that it might not be the most polished thing ever. And a lot of video games back then weren't. Even in the PS3 era, boy, there were bugs galore. But with that being said, like, art isn't perfect. That's like the heart of what I'm trying to get to, is that art is not perfect. And when we enter into this era, or have entered into this era of ultra smooth, ultra sanitized, ultra similar, ultra homogenized works, it definitely makes the gaming scene as a whole less interesting to get involved in. Again, that's not to say that all video games are, the same. Again, you can probably think of 3 off the top of your head that came out maybe this year, maybe like close to last year, that stick out from the norm, but nevertheless they are the exceptions and not the norm. Where I remember when I was growing up, there were a lot of video games that you couldn't sleep on because you didn't know which one of them was going to be good. But anyways, with that being said, ultimately something that I wanted to bring this conversation back to, and something I wanted to bring this conversation back to was that games should kind of embrace a sort of messy design, and not necessarily try to polish themselves up to this weird, hyper realistic sensation. Again, like focusing so much on graphics and to an extent storytelling has left diminishing returns in, the actual game portion of video games, where I don't know, personally I just don't see too many modern games as being fun to play, or at least fun to play again, if that makes any sense. Um, and also, I kind of thought about this a while ago, but I'll cram this in anyways. Is the fact that, at least if you listen to the people in the collector space that kind of talk about the PS5 and how that generation, or this generation rather, is not very exciting in terms of video games being made for it. And part of that reason too is because of the whole video games as art thing. In a medium where the games being made are supposed to speak to people on different levels, when you remove a lot of the vision that the devs can have and, bring in these corporate transactions, for lack of a better term, that devs now have to put in it, actual resource and man hours and stuff gets put into it, you end up with not a lot of interesting ideas to be explored in the time frame that they're given. Of course, I'm not a game dev. I don't exactly know the ins and outs, but what I do know is that, we are a couple years into the PS5, and there has only been one video game that has actually used the tech of the PS5 in an interesting way, and that's Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, where during like a shootout, you can teleport to another side of the map instantaneously and get a tactical advantage on the opponent, and shoot him from there. Haven't played the game, but it looks really interesting, and despite that game being like a launch, if not close to launch, PS5 title, most of the other PS5 games have only utilized the lack of loading screens. Even, even like, no, not even. It's actually the norm for PS5 games to only lack loading screens in the grand scheme of things. Anyways, don't want to draw on this topic too much. There's a lot more I could say, but with that being said, hey, thank you for watching, and I appreciate your viewership. Until next time.